in the high desert country of eastern Nevada in the autumn of 1889, a young woman named Cora Vane paid $1 for a jailhouse, not the land beneath it, not the lot on which it sat, baked hard as pottery by 30 years of high-altitude sun. Just the structure itself, an 8-foot by 12-foot steel-framed cell block welded onto a timber base, hauled out of the town of Alderton, when the county seat moved north and left the old settlement to dry and diminish like a wound. The auctioneer in Elko had laughed when she raised her card. A few of the men around her had laughed too. One said she had bought herself a very small and very ugly home. Another said she had bought herself a coffin that hadn't yet found its body. Cora did not laugh. She folded her receipt into the breast pocket of her coat, turned from the auction yard, and arranged with a freight hauler to bring the cell to the parcel of scrubland she had leased east of town. She paid the hauler a deposit of $2 and shook his hand on the balance due upon delivery. The auctioneer was still smiling when she walked past him. She did not look at him. She had $40 left in the world. She had her father's tools. She had a thing the men around her did not have, which was the knowledge of what a welded iron seam can hide and what a hollow wall can hold, and she had no intention of explaining it to anyone. The parcel east of town was 3/4 of an acre of caliche flat with a shallow draw along its northern edge, where a little grama grass grew in the dry season and a great deal of mud accumulated in the wet. She had leased it for $4 a year from a rancher named Corbell, who owned a block of land northeast of Elko and had no particular use for the scrubby outer fringe of it. Corbell had seemed mildly curious about why a woman alone would want a flat piece of high desert caliche with no water rights attached to it, but he had not pressed the question, and she had not answered it. The lease was month to month. She had paid 3 months in advance. If you have ever stood in a place that the world decided wasn't worth keeping, take a moment and stay with this story. What gets thrown away sometimes carries more weight than what gets preserved. The cell had arrived in Alderton in 1856, commissioned by the 1st Territorial Sheriff, and hauled overland from a fabricator in Salt Lake City at considerable expense. It was a fine piece of ironwork by the standards of its day, double-walled on 3 sides, the 4th side being the barred door that locked with a case-hardened deadbolt. The fabricator, a man named Wick Hale, who had learned his trade in a Pennsylvania rolling mill, had built the double wall for insulation against desert cold, filling the cavity between the outer iron skin and the inner iron skin with a layer of tamped clay and sawdust 2 inches thick. Sheriff Alderton, the town's founding figure and its first lawman, had been proud of the commission. He had called it the finest lockup in the Nevada Territory, which was not a crowded field in 1856 but was still meant as praise. Cora's father, Hugh Vane, had known Wick Hale. Not well, but well enough. They had both worked in the Salt Lake yards in the early 1852s, Hugh as a general fabricator and Hale as a specialist in structural ironwork, and they had eaten midday meals together on the loading dock, often enough that Hugh knew Hale's habits and Hale's methods. Hale believed that a properly built iron structure should be able to hold anything you asked of it, and he built accordingly. Hugh had spent 3 years working iron in the Salt Lake yards before his eyesight began to fail, a gradual dimming at the edges of his vision that made fine close work increasingly difficult and finally made it impossible. He moved the family to a small ranch outside Elko, where he kept a forge going in the lean-to, and took whatever repair work came his way from the ranches and the mine operators and the freighting outfits that passed through. He was not a man who spoke at length about what he knew, but he taught in the way of a man who believes that knowledge is best transferred through the hands rather than the mouth. He would set Cora at the bench with a piece of work and watch her, and when she made a wrong judgment, he would not correct her in words, but would take the tool from her and do the thing correctly once and hand it back, and she would do it again until she had it. He had taught her to read metal the way a river pilot reads water, by the surface signs of what moved underneath. The color of a weld told you its temperature history. The scale pattern on a plate told you whether it had been properly normalized or rushed through the quench. The way a seam gave or held under a tapping hammer told you whether the space behind it was solid or hollow, and if hollow, how large the hollow was, and whether it was filled or empty. He had taught her the particular sound a hollow space makes when struck, the note it produces that differs from solid fill, a half-tone higher, and with a faint ring underneath, like a bell struck through cloth. He had demonstrated it first on a double-walled flue box he had built for a mine operator, running the ball peen along the outer skin in a slow path and letting her hear the shift from solid to hollow and back again. She had heard it immediately, that change in pitch and resonance, and had asked him why the hollow sounded different. He had said that what you struck was not just iron, but air, and air has a voice that iron alone does not have. She had been 11 years old. She had not forgotten it. He died in the winter of 1887, a chest illness that came on in November and did not loosen. He left Cora the tools, the forge, the lean-to, and a cattle note that came due the following spring. She paid the note. She lost the ranch. She moved into a boarding house in Elko and took in mending for 14 months while she decided what to do. The tools she kept in a canvas roll under her bed. She took them out once a week and wiped them with an oiled cloth and put them back. She had not yet found what they were. She had gone to the auction with no intention of bidding on anything. She had gone to watch, to listen, to understand what the county disposed of and at what prices. The sale had been described in the auctioneer's sheet as a steel confinement unit, surplus county property, no reserve. When she saw it on the lot, she recognized it immediately for what it was. She knew who had built it. She knew how he had built it. She knew with the particular certainty that comes not from guessing, but from knowledge, that the double-walled cavity of a Wick Hale construction was not always filled only with clay and sawdust. The freight hauler set the sell on her leased parcel on a Wednesday morning. He accepted $3 for the haul and drove away without curiosity. Cora spent that afternoon walking around the structure, running her hands along its outer skin, pressing her ear to the iron and tapping with the ball of her father's riveting hammer. The sound was what she had expected. On the north wall, the tone shifted. 6 inches from the base, running about 30 inches across and 12 inches high, the ring changed. Not dramatically. A person who had not been taught to hear it would not have heard it. But it was there, that half-step elevation in pitch, that bell tone, under cloth, exactly as Hugh Vane had described it. She did not open it that day. She built a small fire in the grate she had brought with her, brewed coffee, and sat on an upturned crate with the hammer across her knees as the desert turned orange, and then purple, and then dark. She thought about what a sealed cavity in the north wall of the Alderton jailhouse could contain. She thought about who would have put something there, and when, and why. It had stayed sealed for 30-odd years while the county moved north and left the old cell to sit in a diminishing town. She thought about her father, who had said once that iron keeps better secrets than men, because iron does not drink, does not brag, and does not eventually need to confess to a priest. There is a difference between finding a thing by luck and understanding a thing by knowledge. She had not stumbled onto anything. She had read the evidence and arrived where the evidence pointed. That is not fortune, that is craft. She began the following morning before the sun reached the wall. The desert in late October was cold before 9 o'clock, the air dry and thin, and carrying a bite that eased as the sun climbed, but never entirely went away. She wore her coat and her heaviest gloves, and she built a small fire in the grate at a distance from the structure so the warmth reached her hands while she worked. She had brought a set of cold chisels in 3 weights, a flat pry bar, a mallet, and her father's ball-peen hammer. The one with the hickory handle that Hugh had rehung himself the year Cora turned 12, wrapping the throat with a strip of boot leather so the grip never loosened in a wet hand. She laid the tools out on the upturned crate in the order she expected to use them and stood in front of the north wall for a moment before she began. The outer iron skin of the north wall was oxide red, with rust in patches, streaked with the dark mineral staining of 30 years of weather, but it was not pitted through and its integrity was sound. Wick Hale had used a good plate stock, heavy enough to resist the casual blow and the freeze-thaw cycle both. She started at the upper edge of the hollow section and worked her way down, running the lightest chisel along the seam between the outer plate and the framing iron that held it, not trying to open anything but mapping the weld line by feel. Hale's welds were old, but they were continuous. She could feel the solid beat of each one under the chisel tip, uninterrupted, and without the give that would indicate a break. She worked back and forth for the better part of an hour, covering the full perimeter of the section she had identified by sound. She found nothing in the top edge or the right edge that deviated from the welded seam. In the lower left corner, at a point about 3 inches from the base, the chisel found a gap, not a broken weld. A seam. A clean, deliberate seam between 2 pieces of plate, the sort of joint a builder makes when he plans to take a section back out and does not want to compromise the work around it by welding it in fully. The gap was tight, barely a 32nd of an inch, and it was filled with compressed clay that had cured hard as fired brick in the 3 decades it had sat there. She worked it with the chisel tip for 20 minutes, clearing the clay from the gap one small fragment at a time, and when she had the full perimeter of the section freed of its clay packing, she switched to the flat pry bar. The plate was approximately 10 inches square, its edges lapped behind the framing iron on all 4 sides, and held in place by nothing but the pressure of the clay fill behind it and the frictional grip of its own weight against the iron it rested on. She set the pry bar at the lower left corner and eased it in a 1/4 inch and held the pressure steady, not levering hard but letting the bar find the plane of least resistance and work into it. She moved to the lower right corner and repeated the motion, then back to the left. 3-inch increments, working back and forth to keep the plate from racking in its seat, which would have jammed it at an angle and made it unmovable without destroying the surrounding structure. 12 increments, 15. The plate shifted in its seat by perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, then another 1/16, then held again as the clay behind it redistributed its pressure. She changed the angle of the bar and tried the left edge at mid-height, and the plate moved again, this time by a full 1/4 inch, and then a quantity of reddish clay and coarse sawdust fell from the gap at the base, rattling against the iron and landing in a small mound around her boot. The plate came free on the 18th increment, not all at once, but in a controlled slide, the lower edge tipping out first, and then the whole thing hinging down on the framing iron at the top edge, until she caught it with her free hand and lowered it to the ground. A larger fall of clay and sawdust followed, the fill from the cavity behind the plate cascading out and spreading across her boots and the ground around them. The hollow behind it was dark and smaller than it had sounded when she had tapped the wall, perhaps 8 inches deep at its widest point and narrowing toward the frame on both sides. She could not see clearly into it without bringing the fire closer. She did not bring the fire closer. She reached in with her right hand, her fingers reading the interior the way her father had taught her to read a blind seam, slowly and with full attention, and at the back of the cavity against the interior iron skin, her fingers found something that was not clay and was not iron. Behind the clay, in the hollow, between the outer and inner walls of the Alderton jailhouse, there was an oilskin package. She did not reach for it immediately. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. The package was approximately the size of a folded broadsheet, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed cloth tied with cotton cord. The cord had stiffened but had not rotted. The oilskin had done its work. The hollow had been dry and cold, exactly the conditions under which paper, properly protected, can survive a generation intact. She lifted it out with both hands and set it on the flat of the pry bar across her knees. She opened the oilskin. Inside the oilskin, folded carefully, were 8 sheets of paper. The handwriting on the first sheet was small and deliberate, the hand of a man who had learned to write late in life and had never lost his careful respect for the act. The ink had browned, but had not faded to illegibility. At the top of the first sheet, a date was written, not 1889, not 1870. The date written at the top of the first sheet was October of 1849, which was 40 years before Cora Vane knelt in the Nevada desert and opened the wall that held it. She read the document in full before she moved from her position on the ground. Then, she read it again. The desert around her was very quiet. A hawk made a long, slow circle above the draw, to the north, riding a thermal that she could not feel from the ground, and a pair of sage sparrows moved through the grama grass along the draw's edge and vanished into it. She was aware of these things in the peripheral way a person is aware of their surroundings when their attention is occupied entirely elsewhere. The document was a confession, in the precise legal sense of the word. It had been written and signed by a man named Elias Greer, who identified himself as the business partner and later the sole administrator of a freighting company called Greer and Duval, which had operated out of Sacramento and Salt Lake City from 1846 to 1851. The document detailed, across its 8 pages, a set of facts laid out in plain, deliberate sequence. In the spring of 1849, Elias Greer had altered the partnership ledgers of Greer and Duval to show that his partner, one Thomas Duval, had withdrawn a sum of $4,600 from the company account without authorization, that no such withdrawal had occurred, that the alteration had been performed to allow Greer to dissolve the partnership and retain the assets without Duval's share, while simultaneously filing a civil claim against Duval for the fabricated theft, that Duval, who had no resources to contest the claim and no legal representation in the territory at that time, had been adjudicated liable for the false debt, stripped of his stake in the company, and left destitute in Sacramento in the summer of 1849. That Greer had used the assets of the company, including Duval's rightful half-share, to establish a new freighting concern under his own name, which became profitable and which he had sold in 1856 for a considerable sum. The last page of the document was different in character from the first 7. The handwriting was the same, but the sentences were shorter, and the formality had given way to something closer to plain speech. Greer wrote that he was setting this document inside the wall of the Alderton jailhouse because he was ill and did not expect to recover, and because he had spent 30 years sleeping poorly and intended to sleep better in whatever time remained. He wrote that Thomas Duval had gone north after the Sacramento judgment, and that he did not know whether Duval was living. He wrote that the sum he had stolen, with interest at a fair rate across 40 years, should be reckoned at not less than $9,000, and that his estate, administered by the Bank of Elko under a sealed letter he had separately arranged, contained exactly $11,000, held for the benefit of Thomas Duval or his heirs, upon presentation of proof of the original wrong. He wrote that he had not presented the proof himself because he was a coward, and because he had told the lie so many times he had almost come to believe it, and because naming himself publicly as a thief in his final days required a courage he had not been able to summon. He wrote that he had put the confession in the wall of the jailhouse instead, which was as close to turning himself in as he had managed to come. It was signed Elias Greer, October 1849, in Alderton, Nevada Territory. Cora sat on the ground beside the structure for a long time after she finished reading. The sun had moved by 2 hours or more. The clay and sawdust from the open cavity were still scattered around her boots, the reddish clay drying to a paler color in the dry desert air, the sawdust lifting at the edges when the wind came across the flat. She refolded the oilskin carefully and set it on the crate. She thought about Elias Greer, who had lived with the knowledge of what he had done for 40 years, and had managed it the way a person manages a weight that is too heavy to put down and too heavy to carry without cost, by not looking at it directly. He had put the confession in the wall, not because he intended it to be found, but because he needed it to exist somewhere outside himself, to be somewhere other than only inside his own recollection. The jailhouse had suited that purpose in a way that perhaps a priest's ear or a lawyer's safe had not. A wall seals things. A wall does not judge or speak or eventually die and leave papers. He had trusted the iron more than he had trusted any person, and the iron had kept his secret faithfully, the way iron keeps everything, without preference or opinion. Her father had told her when he taught her the sound a hollow makes, that the reason to learn such things was not to pry into what other people had sealed away, but to understand that what gets sealed is sometimes sealed by someone who could not carry it any further. He had not been speaking of jailhouse walls specifically. He had been speaking of a general truth about sealed things and the effort required to carry a weight alone. She had understood it then as a lesson about metal. She understood it now as something else. She went to the Bank of Elko 3 days after she opened the wall, carrying the original document in its oilskin and a copy she had made herself in plain, clear handwriting on fresh paper. She asked to speak to the bank's president, a man named Alt, and was made to wait 40 minutes on a bench in the outer office before she was admitted. Alt was a careful man with the flat voice of someone who has heard a great many implausible stories and found most of them implausible for good reason. He looked at the document for a long time without speaking, and then looked at her, and then looked at the document again. He said he would need several days to examine the sealed letter in his possession and to verify the claims in the document against what the letter specified. She said she would call again at the end of the week. She folded the copy of the document and left the original on his desk. He did not tell her she could not do that. She did not wait for him to say she could. She came back on the 4th day. Alt met her in the outer office this time rather than making her wait, which told her something without his needing to say it. He confirmed that the sealed letter existed, that Elias Greer had deposited it in 1882, along with the designated account, and that the terms of the letter corresponded precisely to what the confession specified. He said he had not previously known why the account existed because the letter had been sealed and he had not opened it. He had simply administered it as instructed. He said, with a careful precision that she found appropriate, that the account had been bearing interest for 7 years at the prevailing rate. She thanked him and went to find information on where Thomas Duval's descendants might be located. The town of Alderton still existed, though it had dwindled to fewer than 30 residents. She had passed through it twice. She knew that a woman named Nora Patch kept the post office, which was also the general store, and that Nora Patch had been in Alderton for most of her life and knew the names of the families who had come through the territory in the preceding decades. Cora arrived in Alderton on a Friday morning, the oilskin package inside her coat. She found Nora Patch behind the post office counter, a lean woman of about 60, with sharp eyes and the economical posture of someone who had never wasted a movement. Cora set the package on the counter without preamble and asked whether Nora had ever heard the name Thomas Duval in connection with any family in the region. Nora Patch looked at the package and then at Cora for a moment before she answered. She said that there was no Duval family she knew of in the valley, but that she had heard the name once from an old man named Ren Duval, who had passed through in the early 1872 heading north toward Idaho. She said Ren Duval had stopped in for flour and had mentioned, in the course of ordinary conversation, that his father had been cheated out of a business in California during the gold rush and had never recovered from it. She said the man had not seemed bitter, only matter-of-fact, the way people speak of old losses that have settled into the family like weather, a condition rather than a wound. Cora said she thought she might know something about that. It took her 3 weeks to trace Ren Duval to a settlement in the Owyhee country of southern Idaho, where he was operating a small sawmill with his son. The first week was correspondence, letters sent to county offices in 3 directions and to a federal land office that might have records of homestead filings in the name of Duval. The second week was waiting for replies, 2 of which came, and 1 of which confirmed that a Renwick Duval had filed a homestead claim in 1878, near a creek settlement called Sabin in the western Owyhee. The third week was. She made the journey by stage to Winnemucca, and from there by a combination of stage and hired horse, the roads worsening as she went north into the high desert basin, and the basin gave way to the foothills, and the foothills steepened into the Owyhee breaks. She arrived in early November, when the high country had already turned cold, and the aspens were bare, their white trunks thin and numerous along the creek bottoms, the ground beneath them thick with pale fallen leaves that muffled the sound of the horses' footfalls. The settlement at Sabin was a cluster of 4 or 5 structures along a creek, one of them the sawmill, which she heard before she saw it, the rhythmic bite of a muley saw through timber carrying down the creek canyon in the cold air. She found Ren Duval at his mill, a man of about 50, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of quietness that comes from living for a long time in a place that asks a great deal of a person and gives back in proportion to what is put in rather than what is wished for. He had a son work in the lumber yard behind the mill, a young man of 20 or so, who straightened up and watched her with open curiosity when she came down the creek path. Ren Duval himself glanced up from the saw carriage, noted her, and finished the cut he was on before he came out to meet her. She introduced herself. He accepted the introduction with a nod, offered her coffee from the small stove at the side of the mill shed, and she accepted it. She held the cup in both hands against the November cold and did not preamble what she had to say. She handed him the oilskin package without explanation and waited. He read the document standing next to the mill wheel with the sound of the creek below them. He read it through twice, as she had. He set it down on the plank beside his coffee cup. He was quiet for a long time. He said that his father had died in 1863 in Idaho, working a claim that barely paid for the mules that worked it. He said his father had talked about California exactly twice, once when Wren was young and once when he was dying, and both times in the same terms, measured and without heat, as though the injustice had happened to someone else and Thomas Duval was simply reporting it faithfully. He said his father had never expected anything to come of it. Cora told him about the Bank of Elko and the sealed account, and what the document specified. She told him she had brought a copy of the document to the bank before she had come north, and that the bank's president, a Mr. Bai, Alt had confirmed after 3 days of reviewing the sealed letter in his possession that the account existed, that it had been established by Elias Greer and designated for the benefit of Thomas Duval or his heirs, and that it could be accessed upon presentation of the confession as the specified proof. Wren Duval looked at the document again for a moment. Then he looked at her and asked why she had come herself, instead of simply writing. She said that some things should not be done by letter. He nodded slowly and did not say anything more for a while. The creek ran below them. The mill wheel turned. She stayed one night at the settlement's only boarding situation, a back room in a family's farmhouse, and started south the next morning. She had enough money left to pay for the stage back to Elko and for 2 more weeks in the boarding house. She had the tools. She had the leased parcel. She had a structure on it that needed finishing work before winter, a small matter of sealing the access plate she had removed and insulating the timber base against frost heave. At the Bank of Elko, Mr. Alt had asked her during those 3 days of review what she intended to do with the jailhouse now that its wall had been opened. She had told him she intended to make it habitable. He had looked uncertain about what that meant. She did not elaborate. The winter that year came hard and early to the high desert. By December, the ground was iron, and the sky was the color of pewter most days, with a sharp wind from the north that found every gap in a structure that had not been properly sealed. The cell's iron frame held its shape in the cold, but the gaps between the iron and the timber base were wide enough to admit a draft that moved through the interior and made the space uninhabitable without continuous fire. She understood, in those first weeks, what the work was going to require. She spent 3 weeks on the insulation work, banking the timber base with sod she cut from the far edge of the draw with a spade and hauled on the flat of the pry bar, building up the bank in courses and tamping each course solid before laying the next. The sod froze between cutting and laying, which made it harder to work, but more stable once it was placed. She filled the gaps in the iron frame with oakum caulk she had brought from town in a canvas sack, working it in with a narrow chisel, and then pressing it flat with her thumb, running the full perimeter of the base twice, until no draft came through, that she could feel with her hand laid flat against the inside of the wall. The access plate she reseated in the north wall and sealed from the outside with a bead of rendered tallow heated in a small pot and poured along the seam while it was still liquid, the tallow hardening within minutes in the cold into a seal that was not permanent but would hold until spring. The hollow behind it she left empty. The space was clean and dry and would remain so. She had no use for it and nothing to put in it. There was a rightness in that, the hollow that had held a thing for 40 years, now holding nothing, its work done. The cell itself was cold iron, which she could not change, but cold iron can be made livable if the room is small and the fire is steady. She lined the interior walls with split pine planks she bought at a mill south of Elko, hauling them in 3 loads on a borrowed wagon, splitting and planing them herself to a consistent thickness of 1 inch, so they sat flush against the iron skin without gaps. The floor she flagged with stone. She quarried from the rocky ground along the northern edge of the draw. 4 days of work with a 12-pound sledge and a pry bar, lifting the flags out of the caliche, shaping them with a cold chisel on both faces until they sat true, odd-ganning them to the structure on the flat of the pry bar, and fitting them like the pieces of a slow puzzle until they covered the full 12 square feet of floor with no gap wider than a finger's breadth. She fitted a small iron stove from the scrap pile of an Elko ironmonger, a box stove of the kind used in mine offices, its legs missing but its firebox sound and its flue collar intact. She fabricated new legs from scrap wrought iron on a forge she borrowed from the ironmonger for a day's rent, drilling the mounting holes with a hand brace and fitting the legs with enough height to clear the stone floor and allow a proper ash drop. The flue pipe she ran through a hole she cut in the east wall with a star drill and a mallet. 3 hours of work on iron plate that resisted the drill with the particular stubbornness of material that does not know it should yield, and then sealed the collar with a ring of oakum and bent iron strapping. She made the window into a south-facing opening that admitted winter light for the better part of the day. The frame she built from salvaged lumber found behind the Elko livery stable. 2 uprights and a crosspiece mortised together and fitted to the opening in the iron wall. With iron pins she drove through pre-drilled holes in the frame and the iron both. The 2 panes of old glass she bought from a glazier in Elko for 50 cents. One pane slightly larger than the other, so the fit required shimming on one side with a thin strip of cedar, which she soaked in linseed oil before fitting, so it would not dry and crack. By January, the structure was warm enough to work in during the day and cold at night only, in the way that any small heated space is cold when the fire is allowed to go out. She did not know, in that first winter, whether Ren Duval had gone to Elko. She had given him the bank's address and Mr. Alt's name. She had told him that the proof was sufficient under the terms Greer had set. What he chose to do with that information was his own matter, and she had not asked for any report of it. In late February, a letter arrived at the Elko post office addressed to her, care of general delivery. The handwriting on the envelope was plain and careful, the hand of a man who respected the act of writing. Inside was a single sheet. Ren Duval wrote that he had come to Elko in January with his son, that they had met with Mr. Planck, Alt, and that after a period of verification, the account had been disbursed as specified. He wrote that the amount, with 4 decades of compound interest as the bank's president had calculated it, had been considerably more than $9,000. He did not name the figure. He wrote that he and his son had come back through Alderton on their way home, and had stopped at the post office there, where a woman named Nora Patch had given them the name of Cora's leased parcel and a rough description of how to find it. He wrote that they had driven out and had sat in their wagon at the edge of the parcel for a few minutes looking at the structure on it, which they had heard was an old jailhouse, and that his son had asked what kind of person bought a jailhouse and made it into a home. He wrote that he had told his son he did not entirely know, but that he thought the kind of person who did such a thing understood something about sealed spaces that most people did not. He thanked her for coming north herself. Cora read the letter once, folded it, and set it on the plank shelf she had built along the south wall of the cell. She picked up her father's ball-peen hammer, the one with the boot leather wrap at the throat, and went out to continue the work she had been doing before the letter arrived, which was fitting a second course of stone flags around the base of the structure to keep the frost from undermining the timber. Nora Patch had come by once, in December, driving a small wagon and carrying a jar of pickled goods as a gift. She had stood outside the cell for a moment after Cora opened the door and had looked at the lined interior, the stove, the south-facing window, and the stone floor. She had said that she would not have thought you could make something decent out of such a thing. Then she had handed over the jar and driven back toward town. Spring came in late March, earlier than the previous year, and with it came a softening in the ground that made the stone flag work easier and the insulation of the base more stable. Cora expanded the leased parcel by negotiation with its owner, a distant rancher in Elko, who asked little for the additional quarter acre, because he had no use for high desert scrub. She built a small lean-to on the east side, framing it with salvaged lumber and roofing it with tin she bought at the ironmonger, a structure large enough to house a forge and a workbench and the tools she had inherited from her father. She took repair work from Elko and from the surrounding ranches, the kind of ironwork that a working forge in a region of rough use always finds readily. She was precise, and she was on time, and she charged a fair rate that was neither the lowest nor the highest in the county. She did not speak of the confession, or of Reine Duval, or of the Bank of Elko to anyone who had not already been part of it. She had no desire to be known as the woman who had done a remarkable thing. The remarkable thing, as she understood it, had been done by the structure itself, which had held a sealed truth for 40 years, until the right hand had known how to hear the wall and open it. Nora Patch stopped by on occasion after that first December visit, bringing news from Alderton and sometimes bringing a specific question about the price of iron work. In April, she asked, not exactly in the way of asking, whether Cora had heard anything back from the people she had gone north to find. Cora said she had. Nora Patch nodded once, a small and conclusive motion, and asked nothing further. She accepted a cup of coffee and sat on the crate outside the south-facing window and looked out at the desert for a time. Nora said before she left that she thought Cora's father would have been interested to know what his teaching had turned up. Cora said she thought so too. It was a small exchange. It did not need to be anything more. Some acknowledgments are complete in a sentence, and the sentence does not need to be a speech. The ball-peen hammer hung on a peg inside the lean-to, above the forge, on the wall where the light from the south-facing window caught the boot leather wrap at the throat each morning and held it a moment before moving on. Cora had not rewrapped it and did not intend to. The leather was worn smooth and dark with use, and the wear was information, the record of how many times the hand had gripped it and what the grip had meant. She had added nothing to it and taken nothing away. The jailhouse sat in the high desert east of Elko in the autumn light of 1890, its iron walls weathered and its stone floor solid, warm enough in the days, and cold at night the way all honest structures are cold when the fire allows itself to go out. The access plate in the north wall was sealed. The hollow behind it was empty. The document that had lived there for 4 decades was in Reine Duval's possession now in a valley in the Owyhee country in Idaho, which was where it had always been trying to go. Some things take a long time to find the hand that can open them. Most of what gets sealed does not deserve to stay sealed. It is only waiting for someone who knows the sound a hollow makes and who is patient enough to listen. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the comments about it. The next story is waiting just below this one.